Alice Eldridge is an interdisciplinarian with an interest in how sound organizes systems. Her research integrates ideas and methods from music, cognitive science, computer science, and ecology to advance theory and methods in ecoacoustics, as well as to create ecosystemic music. Alice holds a BSc in psychology, an MSc in evolutionary and adaptive systems, and a PhD in computer science and AI. She is currently a professor of sonic systems at the University of Sussex, where she is joint director of the Sussex Digital Humanities Lab, co-director of the Experimental Music Technology Lab, and a fellow of the Sussex Sustainability Research Program. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Alice Eldridge.
Thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as you can tell, I haven't really found my disciplinary home. And I think maybe the Sensing Forest Network is my true home. And thanks so much, Liz, for your talk. It was really, really super interesting. What I'd like to talk about, and I apologize, I'm not quite sure who the audience is, so it could risk getting a bit technical. So I might just skim over things and share the sort of high level ideas with you. As Anna kindly said, I'm interested in sort of interdisciplinary aspects and what I've come to call eco-listening. So engaging with natural soundscapes, both as an experience, but also learning to listen to them. As Liz and I's talks are really nice and complementary, because Liz is focused in a lot on this, the value of listening to natural soundscapes, and I'll have one slide on that at the end. Liz mentioned that there's also the potential to listen kind of computationally to ecosystems to infer some information about the health of those ecosystems, perhaps biodiversity, perhaps some other facet. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this half an hour. So I'm going to introduce, focus on a project that we've been working on. It was a funded project last year by UCAN, and I've learned not to be so ambitious in a 6-month project because we haven't quite finished writing it up. So I apologise. Some of the results are not yet published and not yet finished. So I don't know about sharing this talk, but we'll talk about that afterwards. So first of all, in my talk, then I'm going to give just a very broad context, the motivations for this work, which is the biodiversity crises, and underpinning that perhaps in some way is the fact that there's we are largely disconnected from nature in Western communities in particular, as some of Liz's work has alluded to. I'll outline some of the current approaches to soundscape analyses as a tool for ecological monitoring, and then highlight some of the issues that I see with them in order to provide the ground for this quite wildly speculative, if I'm honest, project where we're trying to look at, we're collaborating with colleagues in neuroscience and inspired by some of the approaches to measuring brain dynamics as an underpinning approach to consciousness, and looking at what tools we can borrow from there to inspire new methods for ecosystem soundscape monitoring. And so I'll share some of those early results with you. Okay, so feel free to drop any comments in the chat, and then we'll come to questions at the end. So the context for all of this, I think everybody might be now familiar with this idea of planetary boundaries. There's some scary assessments which have actually been updated quite recently, looking at the dimensions in which we're sort of living beyond our means, if you like. And we all focus on climate change, but actually biodiversity loss and the integrity of the biosphere is even more critical. So that's the kind of the scientific framework, if you like, and why there's such a strong motivation to find tools to monitor biodiversity. And then on the left, I've sort of got this again, quite wildly speculative, but my hunch is that maybe underpinning this is a sort of thinking that we are a bit of a hubris, thinking that we humans are better than everybody else, and that we have a right to extract things from the planet, and we have more rights than other species, and that is actually one of the causes of this mess we've got ourselves into. And again, hugely speculative, but from initial work, it seems that actually listening and an immersion and listening to soundscapes helps us switch perspective into this what's called ecosystem perspective of recognizing that actually we're all part of the same system. So that's the sort of grand big framework context of the work that we're doing. In particular, we're interested at Sussex on what we might call restoration ecoacoustics. So that was the bad news, if you like, in the past slide. The good news is there are lots of programs which aim to support nature recovery, is the current terminology. And these are local for us. Net Estate in West Sussex is a really strong example of this. We have a student-led project of rewilding Sussex globally, nationwide, Europe-wide and globally, right? There's many initiatives. But and this is fantastic, but in order for these initiatives to be evidence-led, we need a way to create interventions or reduce interventions and then measure whether those interventions were successful, right? So how do we do that? How do we measure ecosystem status, ecosystem health? There's two paradigms. What people have noticed in recent years, it's become very popular, the idea of listening to ecosystems, right? And there's two paradigms of listening. The first one we might think of as automated species. So we can place recorders out in the forests and we can record and we can automatically detect, a bit like Shazam for birds. We can now detect, especially for species in Europe and America. These now are pretty good. Things like BirdNet from Cornell and Merlin is an app you can use. There's many others. So that's one approach. It's a bit like the portrait approach, if you like, in photography. The other approach, which we're interested in, and it's more contentious, is the soundscape approach. So instead of looking at its sort of landscape rather than portrait, instead of looking at individual species and trying to pick them out, we're asking, well, what can we tell from the whole soundscape? From all the species, together with the abiotic components and the technophonic, the traffic and the other human machines. And there's been a whole bunch of work in this in the last decade or more that shows that we can indeed, in these high-level analyses, kind of predict some facets of species richness, abundance, perhaps habitat structure and ecosystem status. Okay, so this is a shift from bioacoustics, the study of individual species signaling, to ecoacoustics, these kind of higher level, community level acoustics. And we can think of this, as I put a sort of stethoscope here, just as doctors have listened to the state of our hearts and our stomachs for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we now are developing this approach. And the soundscape then as a whole is this, instead of trying to separate signals and pick out individual calls, we approach the soundscape as this kind of highly dynamic emergent pattern, which emerges from the interaction of all the organisms and other agents in ecological agents. So whether that's bees and birds and bats, or fish, or wind howling, waves crashing, motors throbbing, this soundscape reflects the activity of the agents in the ecosystem, and it also impacts their future, right? So we've seen some extraordinary work showing that reef fish, for example, tiny reef, and even coral polyps navigate by the sounds of the reef. We see this even in plants. Animals also will seek habitats and navigate by not just individual calls, but the global soundscape. So we recognize the soundscape as this kind of ecological entity, if you like, and recognize that it has a really strong role in ecological processes. So I'll skip through these quite quickly, but just to look at some of the theoretical underpinnings before we look at some of the ways we currently measure it, in order to suggest to ground the approaches that we're taking. So one of the kind of foundational theories, which some people may have heard of, was from Bernie Krause, this idea of an acoustic niche. So just fundamentally in ecology is the idea of niche. Organisms can't live in the same place, they can't eat the same food, they can't breed with the same partners. And in the same domain, we've now thought about an acoustic dimension in this sort of hyperdimensional niche space. And the theory here is a bit like being on a CB radio. If you're all on the same channel, then you can't hear each other, right? So basically, if you can't hear each other, you can't mate. you know, and then that through evolution and adaptation, then this means that organisms will kind of push apart in niche space, in acoustic niche space, much like if you're a musician, you know how to master an audio track, a dance music track, so that each voice has its own space. If you're a musician who composes music or arranges, you know that each musical voice must have its own place, both in time and in frequency. Okay, so this idea really underpinned a lot of early computational ecoacoustics to say, well, if this idea holds, then what we predict is that in pristine habitats where species have co-evolved, we'll get a higher biodiversity. More different species should lead to a higher acoustic diversity, i.e. that so this is a spectrogram on the right, which is like a heat map of sound. There's time across the bottom and frequency up the y-axis, and the redder it is, the more sound energy it is. And so we can see in this example, I'm sorry, I haven't included the sound. We've got some frogs calling down the bottom. You've got grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets in the middle, and then cicadas making these huge noises, and right up the top, the bottom end of some bats. So we can certainly see this kind of banding, this kind of frequency partitioning in some examples, but this is not without problem, and we're not going to go into it, but if people are interested, there's been some great recent critiques of this, both theoretically and empirically. So that's one perspective, is the kind of evolutionary and perspective. Another less developed perspective is this kind of idea of ecosemiosis. So this idea that sound is a physical vibration, yes, but it's also a signal. It's also a source of information, right? So all creatures that need to go about the business of staying alive need to hear each other. And what I love about this approach, this has been developed by Elmo Farina, who is one of the founders of ecoacoustics, is that this actually is a kind of frames the soundscape as a space for multi-species semiosis. We no longer see strict divisions really between human perceptions of sound and other species, between cultural studies and ecology, for example. It creates this sort of unified framework, which I see as really valuable. And what we see then, what we think about then, is this idea, we can imagine the soundscape as this set of physical vibrations, but actually, yeah, this sort of organism-centered view of information that's relevant to me will be picked up if I've got the right senses, if I've got the right ears, right? And that's the same for humans as it is for field mice, as it is for crickets, as it is for coral polyps. And there's something to me quite attractive about that, that framework. And what that suggests then is that actually, as an alternative to saying acoustic diversity equals biodiversity, or biodiversity equals acoustic diversity, well, doesn't a healthy system, is a healthy ecosystem is one in which information can transfer, right? That these semiotic signals can be transmitted and received. And this is sort of, we'll come back to this later on. So underpinning, so from those theories, a number of methods have been developed to measure soundscapes, because this is a key part of this work. It's trying to make cost-effective tools for ecosystem monitoring. So to date, we've got a bunch of what we call acoustic or ecological acoustic indices. Excuse me, I'm just going to close Teams because it's pinging at me. And these are basically short descriptions. In music, we'd call them features, or in speech processing, we call them descriptors, maybe. So basically statistical summaries of audio. And these happen either in the time domain, from the waveform, or in the frequency domain from the spectrogram. And they're pretty crude. They're pretty crude things. They've been inspired by ecologists, the way that ecologists summarize their lists of species, so to give a measure of biodiversity. And I've listed a few here. I'm not going to go into the details of them, but each of the rows in this is a plot of about, I think there's 28,000 per habitat. So it's just a bar plot showing the interquartile range of each of these indices. And this, you can only just see the red line is dawn. So they've been aligned to dawn. And this is 3 different habitats: a forest, an ancient forest, NEP, a rewilding regenerating site, and a barley farm, so a degraded agricultural monoculture. Okay, and this was some initial work we did in sort of looking to validate these indices. Can these simple descriptions of soundscape predict things like species richness? So as a first sort of, the most simple thing, what's the simplest ecological phenomena in the soundscape? The dawn chorus, right? In the UK, things are fairly silent at night. and then before the sun rises, the birds kick off in the springtime, right? So we can see these basic, it's pretty noisy, but these basic statistical descriptions of an audio file, when we have lots of them, do give us this kind of a way to quantify changes in the soundscape. Okay, so the summary there is sort of very crude, but surprisingly powerful in combination. What we're doing there is we're just taking sound, we're chopping it up into small, like 1 minute sections. We're describing that with a number, and then we're plotting those. Okay, and when you plug those together, actually they're surprisingly powerful. So this is a confusion matrix for anyone who's not familiar with it. All it's saying is, can we from a given way to describe a habitat, this is the forest, the rewilding site, and the farmland, 1, 2, 3. If we describe it with a list of species, can we use the species list to predict which of the habitats it was, right? And the blacker this diagonal, the less numbers here, the better it is. Okay, so what ecologists generally do is to get a list of species. They count species and they use that to indicate the health. What we were asking was, well, can we do that with these acoustic descriptions? And all that's relevant here is that there's the off diagonals are whiter, right? There's less errors. So in the UK, the species, if we predict the habitat from the species list, we've got 14% error rate. In Ecuador, 12%. If we do that with the soundscape, we've actually got a lower error rate. So what that's telling us is that the soundscape seems to have more information in it about the ecological status than the list of species. Okay, so that's a kind of, for me, that was a first step in saying there's something in this, there's something worth listening to, if you like. Now, those sort of quite crude descriptions are now being replaced by learned representations. The whole world is now using deep learning for everything. So what we can do is we can again, we won't go into the details of it, but we can use either a pre-trained or a self-supervised deep learning network to, instead of doing some statistics ourselves, essentially provide us a list of numbers which describes those soundscapes. And what this does, if we then plot those, you get this sort of hyperdimensional space which you can squish down into a couple of dimensions. And all this is showing us is that in the top left, we've got different places, so we can see different locations. We can see different seasons are differentiated. We can see different times of day and different habitat qualities. So again, it's sort of giving us some hope that actually with these learned representations, with these sort of simple descriptions, we can tell something about an ecosystem. I have a current PhD student who's doing some really nice work with self-supervised approaches to this, so that we can also interrogate the model and say, well, on what basis are you making that prediction? But well, that's a whole other talk. So maybe he can talk next year. Okay, so today, so the summary of that is it's quite promising, right? There's something in it. There's something we can do with listening to soundscape, but there's also quite a few problems with it. It's not really, doesn't seem to be really generalizable. There's lots of instances where things aren't linearly mapped. It's sort of close but no cigar, if you like, is the summary. So if we dig into some of the issues with this, there's some sort of really high level conceptual ones, right? Counting species is great. People love counting birds. That's really valuable, because in order to, we have to make methods which are adoptable and doable. And birds are great indicator species, and they're really core to biodiversity monitoring. But we've recognized for a long, long time that counting species is not enough. So people like Simon Levin, who's a spatial ecologist, has pointed to the fact that the essential dimensions of diversity, which is key for us if we want to be resilient through climate change, extends above and below species level. Okay, so what Simon Levin is a proponent of, which is what our project is predicated on, is that actually if we zoom out and say, instead of counting species, let's think about the ecosystem as a system. Let's take a kind of complex systems approach and say, well, if we think of the soundscape as an emergent property of the ecosystem, which also affects the system, which is a core kind of complex systems approach, well, is there something else? Is there some other way we can measure some characteristics of that soundscape other than just counting species? So this is quite valuable because in the current situation in ecosystem restoration, we haven't really done this before. We don't really know what good looks like. It may be that species richness increases. It may not. We don't really know that. And lots of ecologists hate me when I say this and say, but you're telling us we shouldn't count birds. I'm not saying that. I'm saying maybe there's other things we can also do. Okay. There's also some quite serious empirical issues with this approach. A recent meta-review showed that actually this is looking at doing a big meta-review of work in ecoacoustic indices as a proxy for biodiversity, and showing that over time, actually, we're not seeing very strong relationships. And in fact, over time, we're seeing a decreasing effect size and even into a negative effect size. So i.e., acoustic diversities, as we look at more and more studies, is not necessarily a proxy for biodiversity. Okay, so what else might we do? I came at this as a musician and having studied dynamical systems theory, and I think for me it's like, well, ecosystems are fundamentally dynamic. Sound travels in space and time. Increasingly, we see things like rhythm is really key in neuroscience, in perception, as well as in bioacoustics. And even, come back to our musical metaphor, we can't kind of appreciate a symphony if we like chop up each bar and look at all the bars individually, right? We have to look at the dynamics of these things. We have to look at the dynamics of these systems in order to understand their behaviors on another level. And this kind of move to complex systems thinking also underpins current calls in restoration ecology. So at the same time as we have this sort of slight crisis in ecoacoustics of, are we measuring the right things? And is our sort of conceptual model even right? Similarly, ecologists are saying, well, if we've got all these nature recovery programs, what should we be recovering? Are we aiming for target species to some point in the past, or actually, given climate change, given all these other problems, what we need is resilient ecosystems? And we know from systems theory that resilient ecosystems that come about through from complexity, from diversity, but also from the connections between things, from the flows of information through systems. Okay, so yeah, as I said, this is highly speculative work, but it feels like an important tangent to have a look, because at the same time as we're saying, well, how do we best measure a complex ecosystem? Is there some way we can measure it from the emergent properties of sound? At the same time, colleagues in neuroscience are beginning to say, maybe we can measure can we measure consciousness? I'm not saying ecosystems are conscious that's again would be a different talk. But what I'm saying is, as consciousness seems a kind of ineffable problem, people are starting to quantify the dynamics, the brain dynamics, which are characteristic of different conscious states. Okay, and so my kind of inspiration is to sort of draw a metaphor between the approaches that they use, which is basically statistical causality and connectivity, looking at connectivity within the brain and the way information flows across the brain, and to draw an analogy which will fall down at some points, but to draw an analogy between sensors on a brain, measuring signal flows, and sensors on a landscape measuring the vibrations and the soundscape through the forest. So the kind of grand theory within consciousness science, which this underpins, is about integrated information. It's not uncontentious, but essentially what it's saying is are there flows of information across the brain, and do we have a kind of this idea of dynamical complexity is saying that we have more, exactly that kind of, it's a way of measuring new information as it flows across the brain, if you like. We'll leave it at that. So the analogy of the brain cap then is to say, well, if we get a forest, and this is Plashet Wood, which is a forest that's had the same boundaries since medieval times, just up the road from us here. Each of those points is an audio recorder. If we make a network of those recorders, then we can do the same bits of maths that we do on the brain, which is a kind of Granger causality and then a causal density on those points. So each of those numbers is one of those points. And can we look at kind of information flows in a forest? Okay, that's the sort of grand, that would be a grand future project. We started looking at that, and it's not a 6-month project. So that's the sort of vision, is that end. Meanwhile, there's a whole bunch of different ways to measure complexity. Okay, we can look at the dynamics, we can look at the spatial patterns, we can look at the structural patterns, we can look at the kind of signatures of that. And what we started to look at is this first one, looking at the temporal dynamics of soundscapes as a proxy potentially for their complexity. Okay, so when we do this and what I'm suggesting is that this is a kind of slightly grandiose, but maybe a third paradigm. So rather than looking at counting species or looking at acoustic diversity, that we look at the dynamics of systems as a way to model their health. And I think there isn't a huge amount of time left, so I'm going to just explain really quickly the experimental framework and then show some of the results that we've got. So in restoration projects, obviously we can't wait. We're talking about timescales of not just decades or hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, right? So we can't have projects that long. So what we do instead is we have a kind of space for time substitution. So instead we select habitats across a gradient. As I mentioned already, we have some primary forest, regenerating places, and monoculture. So all the data sets we're using were collected in the UK, in Sussex, and also in Ecuador, in the Choco region, so on the west of the Andes in Ecuador, across this gradient. And just to give you an idea, so that's the UK ancient forest. We have this kind of dense cover of ancient woodland. In NEP, this is 15 years ago in NEP now, it's grown back considerably, but we have this kind of mosaic, a mix of farmland and woodland, and then a barley farm on the South Downs, sparse hedges, some sparse patches of woodland, but really, really kind of bald farmland. And again, in Ecuador, we have dense primary forest, kind of regenerating areas which have been logged and have been growing back, and then some palm oil plantation, and the resolution's not so good there. Okay, so what each of these points is a recorder, and what we did then is recorded for 10 days in each site round the clock, and then you end up with how many it was, like 250,000 1-minute audio files, and then you describe those with you can describe the list of species, you can describe each of those files with a spectral, with an acoustic index. Okay, and under the old regime, what we did then is just bung that into a model, a classification model, a regression model. What we're saying now is maybe there's some information in the dynamics. How do we start to look at that? How do we start to look at the dynamics and the patterns through time at different scales? Okay, is that all right? How much time have I got left, so I know how much to? Okay. Down. Okay, so I'll just show them. I'm going to skip really quickly then. I can't explain all this. So the first thing we said was, can we look at patterns through the day? So dawn, dusk, day, and night. Instead of just lumping all of our data together and taking average, can we see is there a signature about that we can both visualize and model from the changes in the soundscape dynamics? So what these give us is a 3-dimensional histogram of the changes in the soundscape through the day. And what's nice with this is it gives us a visual tool, but we can also then chuck that into a model and use that as a predictive tool. Okay, so if we look at then, so the first question is, and if we look at the dynamics through the day, rather than just averaging all our data, do we get more information about the status of that habitat? And the answer here is yes. So in a multivariate regression, its accuracy, and the green ones are the astronomical histograms, the astrograms, which give us the temporal dynamics through the day. Okay, so that's maybe not news, right? It's not news. It's not particularly new that all ecoacousticians will know that the temporal dynamics give us information, but we didn't currently have a way to visualize and model that. The next question for me was, can we measure the kind of the dynamics of the system from in terms of the sort of from a dynamical perspective, if you like? When I was first in Ecuador, one of the things that really struck me was the kind of coherence of this soundscape. It seemed like all the birds were not just in a frequency and time separation, but really singing together, like dancing together, like dynamically in space and time, kind of coherent. And so the second experiment we did was drawing from dynamical systems theory to map out phase portraits. So all this is doing in this approach, we take a time series. So again, our 1 minute audio file. We then, in this case, we take the RMS, so very, very simple measure of the changes in amplitude. We take that, in this example, it's every 1 second, and we overlap them. And then we have a time series of the changes in amplitude. And this method, which was drawn from dynamical systems, is saying, well, how does that time series change dynamic through time? Does it revisit the same states in a periodic way, or is it really chaotic? And here we have examples from the Shokoan rainforest where we see these. So this is the time series mapped against itself, and there's a whole bunch of maths to do to work out what the lag is. But what this gives you is the attractor basin, essentially, of the dawn chorus. And what we see in the primary forest is these very what seems to be emerging is this pattern of quite tight cycles in the primary forest. In the palm oil plantation, these much more chaotic, random variations, and in the regenerating forest, a kind of similar, a kind of mix between the two, if you like. And again, another example here, we see a kind of, imagine that as an ice cream cone, a kind of 3D attractor where you've got this repeating cycle. Again, the noisiness in the palm oil plantation and the regenerating. And you can measure these, you can measure the kind of chaoticness of these with a Lyapunov exponent. And again, this is early work, but we do see some trends where the most degraded site is the most chaotic. And then finally, again, taking inspiration from neuroscience, we see that even the simplest measures of temporal complexity can predict brain state, so under anesthetic or sleeping or awake. And if we use these same measures, which are very simple compression algorithms, which underlie zips in audio files, in any file in computer science, are kind of it's basically just measuring redundancy. So to what degree is there a pattern in the data? To what degree is the data structured? Okay, so our hypothesis is that looking at the temporal complexity gives us more information about the ecosystem status than just looking at these individual samples. And again, if we do that and then put it in a regression model, we see that this is our current approach, looking at the raw data just with the individual files. If we do the Lem-Poziv, look at the temporal complexity, we get an increase in accuracy. And if we combine them at some point, sometimes we get a decrease, which isn't intuitive, and we need to look into why. But again, it gives us a pretty strong pointer that looking at the temporal patterns gives us useful information, which is really intuitive, right, to any musician, but it's not what we're currently doing in ecoacoustics. Okay, so sorry I've gone on a little bit long. Just to wrap up then, what we're proposing is that we can have a shift, that listening, counting birds will always be valuable, that some measure of diversity may be valuable, but we really should also be looking at the dynamics of soundscapes in order to understand them. And we can understand this. This is pointing then to drawing on this idea of the soundscape as a semiotic interface, as a place where information flows, which species can take advantage of. And there's loads of open questions, right? We don't even know what the relationship is between soundscape complexity and ecosystem complexity. We're not even really sure what the relationship is between ecosystem complexity and these other emergent properties of stability, resilience, provision of resources, so on and so forth. So it's a huge potential. It's not a quick fix. It's a huge kind of new potential direction. But our initial results seem very promising. So finally, to say that obviously this isn't my work alone. This was a collaboration with a brilliant team of people at Sussex across disciplines, across neuroscience, music, neuroscience and mathematics. And the original data collection similarly was a huge team effort of a number of staff, students and volunteers. And very finally, a plug for a live project at NEP. So listening in to the positive effects that the beavers are having. It's online. Wilding.radio is a long-term experiment in kind of monitoring these systems, but also enabling you to listen in to these kind of long-term changes, potentially in increasing complexity. I'm not sure. So sincere apologies for that slightly jam-packed talk. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.